given by our hand in the meadow that is called Runnymede, between Rinzor and Staines, on the 15th day of June in the 17th year of our reign. This is, of course, talking about the Magna Carta. 15th year, or no, 17th year of John's reign was, of course, 1215, if you know your history. So June 5th, 1215 at Runnymede. Runnymede is about 20 miles west of London, about 3 miles away from Windsor. And so this is like a major document in British history. We learn very little about it here in American history, although it is given lip service at best. So I thought I'd look it up and actually talk a little about it. Interesting thing about it is you can actually find it online. So yeah, you can actually read it, which I have. It's hard to understand a little bit because it is, of course, talking in 13th century English, which is somewhat out of date. So there are parts of it which are hard to understand. But I thought I'd talk about it because it is somewhat important. And we give it lip service, but don't really understand it as well as we should. So what happened? The barons of England, they basically had the freedom to do whatever they want as long as they maintained allegiance to the king, which they did. And then Henry II comes along and says, there's a problem here. We are dealing, you're all following British law as you should be doing, except for you're sort of doing it differently. And so justice in one baronial land is different from justice in another. So Henry II comes around and he creates basically a sort of common law type thing, which it's still the old ancient law, but it's more or less justice comes from the king rather than from the individual barons, which people liked because the barons, some of the barons at least, were sort of overwhelming their subjects. But it left room for the king to do wrong, which by the time we moved to John, Henry II was the father of Richard I and John, and so eventually John becomes king, and by the time we get to him, the crown has already started to abuse things to some extent. So the barons turn around and say, first the barons, they didn't just rebel. They did what they should have done. They met, they had councils. There was the Council of the King, or Council of the Crown, I believe, which was a sort of prelude to Parliament. That's sort of the best definition I could find of it. And they would make their petitions there, and the king more or less ignored them. And so the barons started meeting together and saying, what do we do about all this? What was his name? Fitzpatrick, I believe. Robert Fitzwalter. There we go. Robert Fitzwalter. He was sort of the main organizer of all this. Aside from that, most of what I could find said that the barons are somewhat unimpressive. None of them really stood out historically. However, Stephen Langston, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, was on their side, and he's the big name that comes forth in all this. And so they met. 1213 was the earliest date I could find for their meeting. They might have been meeting earlier than that. That was one of the major meetings they had. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Finally, they started holding minor rebellions. They actually captured a few cities. London, they captured London. They captured Exeter, Lincoln. Those were like the three biggest cities, but they captured a few others, I believe. And eventually, they forced a meeting with the king at Runnymede. So, now it's an interesting thing coming on here. It talks about in the charter, it talks about the. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself again. So it is the Magna Carta, was what it was eventually called, which basically means the Great Charter. Now, a charter, in modern terms at least, or as we would speak on it, is basically a founding document. If you're creating a club, you have your charter document, and it tells the purposes of the club, and it tells the basic rules. It's almost a constitution of some sort. That's really not what the Magna Carta was, even though it was called the Grand Charter, because it continues to make reference to the ancient British law, and so it's more of a Bill of Rights. So we're always told Magna Carta says that the king is subject to the law. That's the 2 second description we often get of it. And to some small extent, it did do that, but in a larger sense, it was more of a Bill of Rights. It didn't really say you have to follow the law. It said, look, within the laws, we still have these rights, and things will be done this way. So, yes, it did say the king followed the law, but no, it also didn't really say that. It just said we have rights within the law, and here's how they are going to be defined. That's sort of the best way to look at it. Again, that's just your 2 second description. Now, so like the first clause was about the church, and it was basically church lands are free, and king's not going to do anything on those. And then the rest of the clauses, which are about 50 more, were the rights of quote unquote freemen. And of course, we are still living in a feudal society, servitude still exists, so freemen was basically the barons, the knights. There were some commoners, merchants, and all, but there were also at the same time non freemen in this whole setup. So you got to take that with a grain of salt. And a lot of them dealt with, so one of the big problems was taxing of the baronial lands, and so a lot of it deals with taxes. And I'm going to put that in finger quotes because there are all sorts of different names. There are reliefs, I think there are aids, there are scutages. Basically, various forms of payment are listed, which, again, for an American, we would just lump this all together and say taxes. And there is stuff like, the inheritance tax. And so, when a baron died and someone inherited his land, his son took over, they were expected to pay a fee. And the fee was set according to the ancient rights by the Magna Carta. So it's still referring back to ancient law. It's just making sure that the king doesn't overstep, because apparently John was overstepping and saying, trying to get more than he should have. So we go to that. There was a lot about due process of law, so that affected people. And so there were several clauses dealing with having a proper trial, having proper charges read against you. The person charging you is not allowed to oversee the trial, stuff like that. There are also stuff which weren't really rights related, but they were in the same category. So, like standard weights and measures were set, and all it was on that was just according to London, because apparently throughout England, a pint wasn't the same, a pound wasn't the same. But they turned around and they just have one clause saying, we're going to use the London standard for all our units and measures. And so they got that going. And that's, like I said, you have to understand ancient British law a lot better than I do to really go through this. Just hitting the high points. And again, pointing out it wasn't really about the king must follow the law so much as here are the guidelines the king will use when he makes judgments. Um, According to one book I read years ago, it sort of, I don't know, I'm not going to say it disappeared. It was like they signed it and then sort of forgot all about it, or it didn't come up for 2 or 3 kings later. Someone turned around and said, wait a second, what about Magna Carta? And so it's one of those things they just sort of accepted and then it just didn't talk about it until a few kings later. Uh, one of the kings started breaking Magna Carta and someone brought it up. And again, that was a book I read a long time ago, so I tried to find out when this happened and didn't come up. I didn't know how to do an internet search on it and I can't remember where that book is. So that is the largest part about it. So I got thinking about this because after this, so like I said, they had the Council of the Crown or the King's Council, King Council. There we go. I got it listed here, and that's another thing. So grievances were made according to the King's Council or by the King's Council. But like I said, it was sort of individual barons saying, "I have this problem. I have this problem," and when they started to meet and the barons started to get together, they started saying, okay, let's get our collective grievances. What's the problem we all agree on? So rather than everyone coming and pelleting the king with our individual I want, let's find out the major problems we're all having and go to him with those. And that way it's collective bargaining, and then we can work on the smaller stuff later after we get the big stuff taken care of. And I bring that up because, again, to some extent, that's what we did here in the Americas. The colonies were writing to King George saying, look, we have this problem we don't like, we have this problem we don't like. And eventually the Continental Congress got together and said, look, let's start sending these collectively instead of each colony doing its own, because the king can just turn us against each other. And so if we have a united front and we go at them with the problems we collectively agree on, we might get something done. And Continental Congress was ignored for a while, and so then we eventually declared independence, which would be the equivalent of the barons rising up and taking over cities. So to some extent, it's important to us in America because we sort of did the same thing. Not exactly the same, but there are parallels that can be seen. Also among this, so we had the Council of Kings, and then, let's see, I looked up a few things about Parliament. So Parliament existed in different forms. It wasn't really called Parliament until we had the Model Parliament, which was in, where was that? Scroll down here. 1295, they formed what was called the Model Parliament. Then 1341, the House of Commons separated from the House of Lords. And again, Commons was not the common man, it was knights and burgesses. So again, I didn't have a common voice other than the fact that I was serving this person who had a voice. Let's see, the Scottish Parliament merged with the English Parliament in 1707. Yeah. And that's bringing us closer and closer to us here in the United States, to the point where it's like, okay, you're giving the Scottish people a say in Parliament, their own say in Parliament. Why don't you give us our own say? Which is, again, part of American history. So this is, again, one of the reasons why I think this is sort of important to look at, is because it affected us. Now, the interesting thing here is again 1215 up until 1776. We're talking around 550 years, with rights being given a little at a time, Parliament evolving over time. So it didn't just happen, oh, we got freedom. It was a process which took us over 500 years to get from Magna Carta to Declaration of Independence, which is something when we did study Magna Carta for the 2 seconds we studied it in high school, got me to thinking about why do we today go around the world expecting to just get freedom to places? You know, this place. I was going to do this before we invaded Iran last Saturday, but never got around to. I was still doing my research on Magna Carta, and then we invaded Iran. So yes, I do want freedom for the people of Iran, but are they ready for it? Did they go through the 500-year process? And maybe you'd have to study Iranian history for that. But we have other countries. Back in high school, we were running around the world and talking about how we were going around, you know, helping these countries to gain independence. At the same time, though, we were sitting in history class and looking and saying, wait a second, we didn't just become free. We had to work our way up to it. Are these other countries doing the same? So I got to question, our foreign policies. Yes, we want freedom for people, but are they ready for it? We got ours a little at a time, whereas we think we'll overthrow the tyrant and then they'll form their own government. And what we've done more often than not is create a power vacuum, which eventually turned against us. Saddam Hussein, we put in power because we thought he would do a good job, and it didn't because maybe Iraq didn't go through the process we went through to get our individual freedoms. So that is it. Like I said, this is something ever since high school I've been thinking about this, and some current events have led me to thinking about it more. And, part of our current policy, should we be doing this, or should we be expecting the nations to go through a few steps before we help them gain their quote unquote freedom? Because some of them aren't as free as we thought they would be when we left them. That's it. Like I said, Magna Carta, interesting. You can find it online, like I said. Read it. Use really ancient English, so not always understandable, especially to us in America, but still worth looking at. Have a nice day.